The night sky over France stretched endlessly above, a thick layer of clouds obscuring the distant glow of the cities below. Air Interflight 148, an Airbus A320, sliced through the darkness, its engines humming steadily as it cruised toward its destination. Inside the cockpit, Captain Christian and First Officer Joel Cherubin maintained a calm, professional demeanor, their focus on the instruments before them. The flight from Lyon to Strasbourg was a routine one, a shared domestic hop that should have posed no challenges. Yet as the aircraft approached its descent phase, unseen factors had already set a fatal chain of events into motion. The passenger cabin was quiet, the atmosphere peaceful. The dim glow of overhead lights illuminated the faces of travelers, many of whom were businessmen and professionals making their way home after a long day. Some read newspapers, others dozed off, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the engines. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seat belts, clearing away trays, and preparing for arrival. It was an ordinary night, indistinguishable from countless other flights that crisscrossed Europe's skies. In the cockpit, Captain studied the descent charts, planning their approach to Strasbourg. The terrain around the airport was challenging, surrounded by the looming peaks of the Vosges Mountains. Their descent needed to be precise, carefully controlled. Unlike other aircraft of its generation, the Airbus A320 used a unique navigation system. Its flight path angle, MOOD, a relatively new feature, required pilots to input descent angles instead of traditional vertical speeds. It was a system designed to simplify approaches, but it also introduced an opportunity for deadly misunderstanding. Wheel set 3 degrees for the descent, the captain instructed, his voice steady as he reached for the autopilot controls. First Officer Cherubin nodded, adjusting the flight control panel accordingly. The small digital display flickered as he dialed in the descent. What neither of them realized in that moment was that instead of setting a controlled 10-degree descent, they had mistakenly entered the vertical speed mode, commanding the aircraft to descend at a rate of 3,300 feet per minute. The distinction between these two settings was subtle, yet the consequences would be catastrophic. As the aircraft began its descent, all appeared normal. The nose of the plane tipped slightly downward, and the altimeter ticked steadily downward. Outside, the world remained hidden beneath thick cloud cover, the darkness of the mountains below blending seamlessly with the sky. The pilots, relying entirely on their instruments, trusted that the automation was guiding them safely. Unbeknownst to them, Flight 148 was descending far too rapidly. The aircraft, designed with automation, was now following an incorrect command, hurtling toward the mountainous terrain at a dangerously high rate of descent. But inside the cockpit, there was no immediate sense of alarm. The instruments reflected the descent, but the numbers did not seem overtly concerning yet. The confusion stemmed from a flaw in cockpit design, where the flight path angle mode and vertical speed mode appeared similar but functioned in critically different ways. At 10,000 feet, the plane's rapid descent continued, unnoticed by the pilots. The approach was still routine in their minds, the checklist being followed methodically. The cockpit remained calm, a quiet hum of instruments and occasional radio chatter filling the air. Outside, the dark peaks of the Vosges Mountains loomed ahead, invisible to the naked eye. Without a proper terrain awareness warning system, an omission in the aircraft's safety design at the time, there was no automated voice alerting them to the imminent disaster. Captain glanced at the instrument panel, scanning their descent profile. "Everything's looking good," he remarked absently, unaware that their altitude was dropping far faster than intended. The passengers, oblivious to the danger unfolding in the cockpit, continued their routines. A man near the front adjusted his watch, preparing for arrival. A woman in the back tucked a blanket around her sleeping child. The flight attendants secured the last few items in the galley, expecting touchdown in just a few minutes. The altimeter continued to spin downward. 6,000 feet. 5,000 feet. The aircraft remained locked in its automated descent, obeying a flowed command. 4,000 feet. Somewhere outside, hidden by the blackness of night, the jagged peaks of the Vosges Mountains stood unmoving, their ridges waiting silently beneath the aircraft's flight path. 3,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, there was no urgency, no panic. The pilots, still confident in their instruments, saw no indication that anything was wrong. 2,000 feet. The aircraft's nose adjusted slightly, compensating for minor wind changes, but still plunging rapidly toward the forested slopes. 1,500 feet. Suddenly, a flicker of movement on the radar. Something ahead. The captain's brows furrowed slightly. 1,000 feet. Too low. Something was wrong. 750 feet. First Officer Cherubin's head snapped up, a sudden realization dawning on him as he glanced at their altitude. His mouth opened, but the words never came. 500 feet. The black void outside the cockpit window was no longer just sky. It was something solid. 300 feet. A burst of alarms, far too late. 200 feet. A sudden intake of breath. The descent continued smoothly, the cockpit illuminated by the soft glow of instrument panels as Flight 148 glided through the thick night sky. Outside the cockpit windows, there was nothing but an endless void of blackness, the dense cloud cover obscuring any view of the ground below. Rain speckled the windshield in sporadic bursts, faint streaks sliding across the glass as the aircraft cut through the damp air. Inside, Captain and First Officer Cherubin remained focused on their instruments, trusting the advanced avionics of their Airbus A320 to guide them safely toward Strasbourg. They had gone through their descent checklist, confirmed their approach, and as far as they could tell, all was going according to plan. But something was wrong. The aircraft was descending too fast. Instead of a controlled and gradual approach, Flight 148 was dropping through the sky at an alarming rate, far exceeding what the pilots had intended. The input they had made on the autopilot panel, a simple command that should have guided them down at a safe 10-degree flight path angle, had been mistakenly entered as a vertical speed of 10 feet per minute. The numbers on their instruments reflected this descent, yet in the dim glow of the cockpit, no immediate alarm was raised. They trusted their systems, unaware that they were hurtling toward the ground at an unforgiving speed. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere remained calm. Seatbelt signs glowed amber, signaling that the aircraft was now in its final approach. Some passengers, accustomed to frequent travel, barely noticed the descent, their attention still fixed on newspapers, books or quiet conversations. A businessman adjusted his tie and closed his briefcase, preparing for landing. A woman near the window peered outside but saw only darkness, unaware that the mountain peaks of the Vosh range lay hidden beneath the clouds. The first officer glanced at their instruments again, checking their altitude. Everything appeared normal. There were no warning lights, no audible alarms. Yet something gnawed at the back of his mind, a feeling of unease he couldn't quite place. He tapped the altitude readout, watching the numbers count down faster than expected. For a brief moment, he hesitated, then dismissed the thought. The aircraft's automation was handling the descent. There was no reason to doubt the system. At 5,000 feet, the aircraft's rapid descent continued unchecked. The cockpit remained quiet except for the occasional updates from air traffic control, which the pilots acknowledged with routine professionalism. The terrain below remained unseen, hidden beneath thick fog and darkness. With no external reference points, they had nothing but their instruments to rely on. At 3,500 feet, the automated voice of the radio altimeter echoed softly in the cockpit. 3,500. Still, there was no sense of alarm, no realization of the impending catastrophe. The A320 was a marvel of modern aviation, built with redundancy and safety in mind, yet its greatest flaw had been exposed. It was only as effective as the humans operating it. And right now, those humans were making a fatal mistake. Inside the cabin, turbulence caused a slight shudder, prompting a few passengers to grip their armrests, but it was nothing unusual. The flight attendants, moving with trained efficiency, secured loose items and took their seats, their minds already moving to the next phase: arrival, disembarkation, another routine end to another routine flight. They had no idea they were only moments from disaster. At 2,500 feet, the descent rate was still dangerously high. The aircraft's ground proximity warning system, a safety feature designed to alert pilots of imminent train collisions, had not been installed on this particular 1820 model, a decision made during measures when the aircraft was first designed. It was a flaw that would prove deadly. At 1,500 feet, the clouds still concealed the jagged train below, giving the illusion of safety. The pilots, still unaware, continued their preparations, believing they were on track for a safe landing. The city lights of Strasbourg were just ahead, or so they thought. At 1,000 feet, First Officer Cherubin frowned, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. The altitude seemed off. He shifted in his seat, scanning the instruments, and a realization began to form in his mind, but it was too vague to act on. At 800 feet, the first true moment of doubt registered in Captain's expression. Something was wrong. He glanced at the descent rate again. A flicker of confusion. Then realization. At 500 feet, the first officer opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a physical force. They were too low. Far too low. At 300 feet, Captain hand shot to the controls. Go around, he shouted, the first real trace of panic in his voice. At 200 feet, the first officer yanked at the thrust levers, but it was too late. At 800 feet, the first outlines of trees emerged from the fog, rushing toward them at a speed too fast to process. At 50 feet, the cockpit filled with the sudden, blaring wail of an altitude warning, too late, far too late. The violent impact shattered the night. A deafening roar of tearing metal, splintering trees, and a massive explosion ripped through the stillness of the Vosges Mountains as Air Inter Flight 148 slammed into the dense forest. The force of the crash sheared the aircraft apart, the forward section obliterated instantly as it struck the rugged train. The mid and rear fuselage, turned from the cockpit, bounced and tumbled down the mountainside, breaking into pieces as it carved a path through the trees. Flames erupted from the mangled wreckage, flickering against the canopy above, casting an eerie glow over the destruction. Then, for a brief moment, there was silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of impact fading into the vast darkness. And then came the screams. Inside the remnants of the cabin, survivors lay among twisted metal and shattered seats, their bodies bruised, broken, but still alive. Smoke thickened the air, carrying the acrid stench of burning fuel. Passengers who had moments ago been adjusting seatbelts or closing their briefcases were now trapped in a nightmare, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Groans of pain, desperate cries for help, and the crackling of spreading fire mixed into a horrific symphony of disaster. Some managed to unbuckle their seatbelts, stumbling through the wreckage in search of an escape, while others remained pinned beneath twisted beams and debris, their voices lost in the chaos. In the rear section of the aircraft, which had miraculously remained somewhat intact, a handful of passengers fought to find a way out. A man, blood streaming down his forehead, used his bare hands to tear at the warped emergency exit, his fingers slipping against the metal. A woman sobbed as she cradled a child, shielding them from the sharp edges of broken seats. Somewhere further down the wreckage, a faint voice called out, a voice still alive, but growing weaker. The realization was setting in. Not everyone had survived the impact, and those who had were running out of time. The night air was frigid, the temperature dropping rapidly as cold mountain winds howled through the broken fuselage. Fire licked at the remains of the aircraft, illuminating the scattered wreckage in a hellish glow. The emergency beacon, though battered and partially buried beneath debris, had begun transmitting a distress signal. But the crash site was deep within the mountains, far from any easy access points. Even if rescuers had picked up the signal, it would take time for them to arrive. And time was something not everyone had. A man stumbled through the wreckage, his leg broken, his breath coming in short gasps. He had no idea where he was, only that he had to move, had to get away from the fire, from the wreckage, from the suffocating smell of burning plastic and fuel. Every step sent sharp pain shooting up his leg, but he kept going, his mind fixated on one theme: survival. He heard voices behind him, others still struggling to escape. He turned back, his instincts warring against his pain. There were still people trapped. And no one else was coming to help. Not yet. The minutes dragged on like hours. The cries for help began to fade, some succumbing to injuries, others to the cold. The fire continued to spread, devouring the remains of the fuselage, sending columns of thick smoke into the night sky. Somewhere beyond the wreckage, the forest stood silent and disturbed by the horror unfolding within its depths. The world beyond had no idea what had just occurred. At that moment, a faint flicker of light appeared through the trees. Then another. A distant, muffled voice. The first sign that help was coming. But for many, it was already too late. The emergency signal pulsed weakly from the wreckage, sending a desperate call into the cold night. Deep in the Vosges Mountains, where dense trees and uneven terrain made navigation nearly impossible, search and rescue teams were scrambling into action. At the Strasbourg airport, air traffic controllers stared at their screens in horror. Their radio calls to Flight 148 met with only silence. A plane had vanished from radar. A plane that should have been on final approach. Within minutes, the alert had been sounded. Emergency teams, firefighters, paramedics, and military personnel were mobilized, but the remote crash site made their mission brutally difficult. The thick forest was nearly impenetrable in the darkness, the terrain steep and unforgiving, and the icy night air only made conditions worse. Still, they pressed on, guided only by the less-known coordinates and the flickering distress beacon that cut through the static. The first rescuers to arrive were met with an eerie silence. The trees stood tall and indifferent, their branches dusted with frost, as if shielding the horror hidden beneath them. Then, as they pushed forward, the destruction came into view. Scattered across the mountainside was the wreckage of Flight 148, its fuselage now a shattered skeleton of twisted metal and scorched remains. Fires still burned in some places, smoldering among the broken seats and torn pieces of luggage. The acrid stench of fuel and burning plastic lingered in the air. But beneath the destruction, there were voices, faint, weak cries for help that sent the rescuers rushing forward. The survivors were scattered, some still trapped in the wreckage, others wandering in shock, their bodies battered and bloodied. A young woman, barely conscious, sat slumped against the remnants of a seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A man, covered in soot, stood staring blankly into the distance, too dazed to respond when a rescuer called out to him. Further inside the wreckage, voices grew more desperate. Some were pinned beneath debris, their cries muffled by the weight of metal and shattered cabin panels. Rescuers worked frantically, pulling survivors from the twisted remains, their hands numb from the freezing air, their movements slowed by exhaustion but fueled by urgency. A firefighter pried open what remained of an emergency exit, revealing a small pocket of survivors huddled together, shivering from cold and shock. Their faces were streaked with blood and soot, their eyes wide with the haunting realization of what they had just lived through. Some had injuries too severe to move, while others, barely able to stand, helped their fellow passengers as best as they could. Every movement was critical. The injured needed to be stabilized, the flames needed to be contained, and the wreckage needed to be searched before more lives were lost to the cold. Radio transmissions crackled through the night as more rescue teams arrived. Helicopters hovered above, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the vast stretch of devastation below. Medical teams began treating the wounded, wrapping survivors in thermal blankets, stopping the worst of the bleeding, and preparing the most critical for evacuation. The realization settled in that many had not made it. Amid the frantic rescue efforts, a grim tally was forming, dozens of passengers, their lives ended in an instant. Among the survivors, some wept openly, while others sat in stunned silence, their minds unable to process what had happened. A man gripped his seatbelt, still fastened despite the seat no longer being attached to anything. A mother whispered reassurances to her child, though tears streaked down her cheeks. A flight attendant, her uniform torn, moved among the injured, offering quiet comfort despite her own injuries. The mountain remained silent, indifferent to the tragedy. The trees, the rocks, the frozen ground, none of it cared for the pain of those who had fallen upon it. But the rescuers cared. They carried bodies with reverence, shielded the wounded from the cold, and whispered words of reassurance to those fading in and out of consciousness. Hours passed, and the first glimmers of dawn touched the horizon, casting a pale light over the wreckage. The scale of the disaster was fully revealed. The once mighty Airbus A320 lay in ruins, its fuselage split, its wings shattered, its passengers forever changed. In the coming days, investigators would comb through every detail, searching for answers, for reasons, for lessons that could prevent another night like this. But for now all that mattered were the living, the ones who had defied the odds, who had survived where so many had not. As the last of the survivors were airlifted from the mountainside, the rescue teams paused, exhausted but unwavering. They had done what they could. And as the wind carried the final echoes of that terrible night away, the world beyond the forest was just beginning to understand the full horror of what had transpired on Flight 148. The wreckage of Air Inter Flight 148 lay scattered across the forested slopes of the Vosh Mountains, a silent monument to the catastrophe that had unfolded in the dead of night. As the first rays of daylight pierced through the trees, investigators and emergency teams moved carefully through the wreckage, their boots crunching against twisted metal and charred debris. The rescue efforts had continued through the night, but now, as the final survivors were airlifted to hospitals and the fires had been extinguished, a new phase began, the search for answers. The blackened remnants of the Airbus A320 held the truth of what had gone so terribly wrong, and the world demanded to know why a modern aircraft, flown by experienced pilots, had crashed so violently into the mountainside. Among the wreckage, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, commonly known as the black boxes, were located, battered but intact. These two devices, buried beneath layers of debris, would be the key to unraveling the final moments of Flight 148. Investigators worked carefully, retrieving the recordings with gloved hands, knowing that within them lay the voices of the doomed flight crew, their last decisions, their last words. As the devices were secured and transported to analysis facilities, the grim process of identifying the victims continued. Families had already begun arriving at airports and hospitals, their faces etched with anxiety and grief as they waited for news that many of them already feared to be the worst. At the crash site, the scale of the destruction became clearer in the morning light. The aircraft's fuselage had been torn apart, its sections strewn across the mountainside in a grotesque display of force. Some pieces of the plane had been buried deep into the earth upon impact, while others had been thrown into the trees, where they hung like grotesque ornaments of shattered metal. Passenger belongings, suitcases, shoes, torn clothing, were scattered among the debris, a heartbreaking reminder that these were not just statistics, but lives that had been lost. Investigators combed through the wreckage, piecing together fragments of the aircraft, searching for mechanical failures, structural weaknesses, or any sign that might explain the disaster. As analysis of the black boxes began, experts in aviation safety, human factors, and aircraft systems gathered in tense conference rooms, listening to the final minutes of the cockpit voice recording. What they heard sent a chill through the room. The pilots had been calm, focused, believing they were on a controlled descent into stress beyond. There were no signs of distress, no panic, just routine cockpit conversations, standard callouts. But then, something subtle but crucial: confusion. The descent had been programmed incorrectly, yet neither the captain nor the first officer had recognized it. The aircraft had been descending far too rapidly, yet the automated systems had not warned them. The realization, when it came, was too late. The last words on the recording were chilling. A sudden intake of breath, a clipped order to go around, and then silence. The data from the flight recordings painted an equally damning picture. The descent rate of 3,300 feet per minute, misinterpreted from what should have been a 10-degree flight path angle, had sent the aircraft hurtling toward the ground without the crew fully realizing it. It was a small but catastrophic mistake, amplified by a poorly designed autopilot interface that did not make the difference between the two modes clear enough. Furthermore, the aircraft had not been equipped with a ground proximity warning system, a technology that could have alerted the pilots to the impending collision with the train. Air Inter, like some other airlines at the time, had opted not to install in their fleet, a decision that would now come under intense scrutiny. The aviation world reacted with shock and urgency. The crash of Flight 148 exposed critical flaws, not in the aircraft's engineering, but in interaction. The Airbus A320 was one of the most advanced airliners in the world, but it had betrayed its pilots with an interface that allowed a fatal misinterpretation. The industry had placed immense faith in automation, believing that sophisticated systems would reduce human error, yet here was undeniable proof that automation, if not properly designed and understood, could just as easily lead pilots into disaster. The need for clearer cockpit displays, better training on automation modes, and mandatory installation of ground proximity warning systems became immediate priorities. Regulators moved swiftly. Within months, new directives were issued requiring improved cockpit instrumentation that clearly distinguished between flight path angle and vertical speed settings. Airlines were mandated to install on all commercial aircraft, ensuring that no future flight crew would be left unaware of deadly train ahead. Airbus engineers revised their system logic, making it harder for such an input error to go unnoticed. The loss of Flight 148 would not be in vain. It would change aviation safety forever. For the families of the victims, however, no regulation or technical improvement could undo the tragedy. Memorial services were held across France, as names were read aloud, and photographs of those lost were placed beside candles and flowers. The final resting place of Flight 148 became a site of mourning, a scar in the mountains that bore witness to a preventable disaster. Survivors, forever haunted by the sounds of that night, the screaming meta, the cries for help, the suffocating darkness, faced the lifelong challenge of living with the memory of those they had left behind. As the world moved forward, as air travel became safer because of the lessons learned from this tragedy, the echoes of that night never truly faded. Every pilot trained on an Airbus cockpit, every safety inspector reviewing an airline's compliance with new regulations, every family member staring at a framed photo of a loved one lost, all carried the weight of that moment. Flight 148 had been betrayed by the very instruments meant to guide it safely home. But in its wake, a lesson had been etched into history, ensuring that future flights would never meet the same fate.